Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are dismantling the clock on the wall. We're taking a hard look at the age of the world, but not through the lens you might expect. We aren't arguing about carbon dating versus creationism in the traditional heated sense. We are analyzing a much more subtle yet radical conflict between what we call deep time, the scientific consensus of a universe measured in billions of years, and a concept from our source material called the human horizon.
Yeah, and it's a concept that, I have to admit, made me genuinely uncomfortable when I first read through it. I mean, usually when we discuss history or geology, we rely on a universal timeline, a standardized grid that stretches way back. It's our safety net. But the text we're analyzing today argues that this grid is an imposition. It suggests that the only world that's, well, effectively real is the one measured by human memory and observable continuity.
Exactly. It challenges the very tools we use to orient ourselves. So the core question we're tackling is this. Is the world truly ancient beyond comprehension? Just this vast abyss of time where humans are a blip at the end? Or is the meaningful world, the one we actually inhabit, is it strictly limited to the scale of human memory? I'll be representing the advocate position today. I'm arguing that the world is young in human terms, a view that relies on relational time and physical evidence like river deltas, rather than these abstract imposed clocks.
And I'll be the dissenter. I'm standing here for the necessity of that universal clock. My position is that while this human horizon is a fascinating philosophical exercise, stripping away our calendars and geological timelines, well, it risks stripping history of its precision. I want to test if this reliance on relational time is a genuine insight or if it's just a sophisticated way to dodge contradictory geological data. Because, if we throw away the ruler, how do we measure anything?
A fair challenge. So let's get into the position statements. My argument, it stems from a single provocative premise in the source material, that we've confused the map with the territory. We assume time is an external container, like a metronome, that just ticks, independently of whether anything is actually happening.
And the source argues it isn't? That feels deeply counterintuitive.
It argues that for human purposes, time is really change recorded in matter and memory recorded in people. When you look at the human world, cities, agriculture, writing, metallurgy, all the things that make us us, that world does not just fade back into a fog of millions of years. It stops abruptly. The source material claims there are no hidden global civilizations or forgotten technological ages buried deep in the past. The human story is dense, continuous, and shockingly recent. It fits entirely within a horizon of thousands, not millions of years.
I can see the appeal of that. It's cleaner. But here's my counterposition. You call the calendar a map, but I call it a ruler. And you need a ruler to build anything that stands. My concern is that the source material is committing an anthropocentric error. The mistake of thinking that if we didn't see it, or if we didn't write it down, it somehow didn't happen.
How so?
Because the physical world requires a framework of deep time to explain itself. We don't need human memory to know a canyon is old. We infer it from erosion rates. We don't need a written record to know a rock is 500 million years old. We measure atomic decay. By limiting reality to what can be remembered, you're effectively discarding the most powerful tool we have, scientific inference. You're basically saying that the stage didn't exist until the actors walked out from the wings.
That is the tension, isn't it? Inference versus observation. But let's move to the core debate, because the source material doesn't just stay in the realm of philosophy. It points to the mud, specifically river deltas.
Right, the deltas argument. I found this to be the most tangible part of the text, and honestly, the part that requires the most scrutiny.
The argument is that river deltas, the Nile, the Mississippi, the Tigris, Euphrates, they are not theoretical constructs. They're physical piles of sediment. They're the result of dirt flowing downstream and hitting the ocean, then settling out because of gravity. The source states that all major river deltas on Earth act as clocks. And when you calculate the rate of deposit versus the size of the pile, they all date back to the same general window, a few thousand years.
Which roughly aligns with the start of recorded civilization.
Precisely. The text describes them as shallow, active, and dynamic. If the continents had been sitting in their current state, with these massive rivers flowing for millions of years, these deltas should be enormous geological features, extending hundreds of miles further into the oceans than they do. But they aren't. They're young. The argument is that the very surface of the Earth, the skin we live on, stabilized recently.
Okay, but I want to push back on this, though. I grant you that deltas are active systems. Geologists know they shift, they grow, they sometimes collapse. But the dissenters' view, and the mainstream view, is that you're confusing the current delta formation with the entire geological history of the region.
Explain the distinction you're making.
Well, just because the current lobe of the Mississippi Delta is, say, 5,000 years old, that doesn't mean the continent of North America is 5,000 years old. It just means the river changed course, or maybe sea levels stabilized after the last ice age. The source seems to argue that because the skin is young, the body must be young too. That feels like a massive leap in logic. It's like looking at a fresh coat of paint and saying the house was built yesterday.
I think the source is making a subtler point than that. It's not necessarily denying that rock exists beneath the delta. It's saying that the human world, the environment that permits agriculture and cities and trade, is defined by that young skin. The text says the surface of the human world has not been sitting unchanged for deep eternity. It implies that the deep time model projects a static stability backward that, well, it just didn't exist. The world we live in is a recently stabilized room.
A recently stabilized room. That's a strong image. It implies that before the stabilization, maybe before the flood narrative the text mentions, the world was too chaotic for this kind of continuity.
Exactly. The argument is that if you go back before those deltas formed, you aren't finding a peaceful Earth waiting for humans. You're entering a period of flux that makes history as we know it impossible. So effectively, the world as we know it began with the stabilization of those deltas.
Okay, I can grant that civilizational time matches the deltas. That's an observation even secular geologists might agree with, that human civilization exploded once the climate and coastline stabilized. But the source goes further. It tries to redefine how we track time entirely. This leads us to the second pillar, which is where the text gets truly radical, the nature of time in ancient texts. We need to talk about relational time versus clock time.
This is the part that usually trips people up. It asks us to read the Bible, specifically the genealogies in Genesis, without looking at our wristwatches.
Right. And it's the section that gave me the most pause. Because on the surface, it sounds like an excuse, you know? Oh, the numbers don't match science? Let's just change the definition of the numbers.
I get that reaction. But look at the argument. The mistake we make, according to the source, is anachronism. We assume that when an ancient author wrote year, they meant 365.25 rotations of the Earth around the sun. We assume they were obsessed with chronological precision in the same way a modern historian is. The source argues they were obsessed with relational precision.
Meaning, who came from whom?
And who knew whom? This is the key takeaway. Ancient time wasn't measured by the sun, it was measured by the chain of custody. The text mentions Adam living 930 years. Now, in a modern biological framework, that's impossible. So we usually dismiss it as myth, or we try to find some biological loophole.
Or we try to do those math tricks, like maybe a year meant a month, which, never really works out when you do the math on when they had kids.
Right. And the source rejects all those tricks. It argues that 930 years is a statement of relational longevity. It means his life spans an extraordinarily large portion of early human continuity. He was a living library. If you live 930 years in that relational sense, you are overlapping with 7 or 8 generations of your descendants.
So the function of that number isn't to tell us how many times his heart beat, but to tell us that the memory of the beginning was preserved intact.
Yes. It creates a chain of witness. The genealogies aren't just a boring list of names we skip over. They are a legal argument. They're saying there is no gap. There is no forgotten era. We know exactly how we got here.
I understand the function of it. It's a mechanism for social cohesion. It tells the community, we aren't orphans. But as a skeptic, I have to ask, does this relational time actually map to reality? I mean, if I say the table is long, that's relational. If I say the table is 6 feet, that's objective.
If we abandon the 6 feet, don't we lose the ability to verify anything?
The source would argue that the 6 feet is an illusion when you apply it to the deep past. You can't verify history the way you measure a table. You can't go back and check. You only have the record. And if the record says, we have a continuous chain of memory from the start until now, well, that is data.
But we do have other records. This is my main sticking point. We have ice cores, we have tree rings, dendrochronology that go back 11, 12,000 years. These are annual cycles, they are clocks. If the source says the world is relational, how does it account for a bristlecone pine tree that doesn't care about human lineage? A tree ring is a physical mark of time, regardless of whether a human saw it.
And that touches on the third and deepest point of the debate, the philosophy of deep time versus observation. The source material actually critiques the very existence of those clocks you mentioned, not the rings themselves, but the assumptions we use to read them.
The uniformitarian assumptions.
Correct. To read a clock that's been ticking for 1 million years, or even 10,000, you have to assume the gear speed has never changed. You have to assume uniform gravity, constant decay rates, stable spacetime. The source pulls in modern physics, specifically Einstein's relativity, to remind us that time is not a constant.
Okay, hold on. I have to put my foot down here. Yes, relativity is real. Time dilates near a black hole or at light speed. We know this. But we're talking about Earth. We're talking about the banks of the Nile. Using general relativity to explain why a sediment layer looks old seems like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. The relativistic effects on Earth are negligible. You can't just wave a wand and say Einstein to make carbon dating invalid.
I don't think the source is saying the Nile was near a black hole. It's using relativity as a philosophical wedge. Einstein proved that time is not absolute. It is relative to the observer and the gravity well. The source argues that deep time is a construct that relies on a Newtonian view of the universe, a clockwork universe that ticks the same everywhere, always. It's questioning our arrogance and assuming that the conditions we observe today, decay rates, gravity, the speed of light, have been the eternal standard.
And the source prefers what?
A universe where time is tied to event. Time is change recorded in matter. If there's no witness and no significant change recorded in the human sphere, the source challenges the validity of projecting empty time backwards. It says science is strongest when it is close to the witness, close to what is tested and remembered.
Refusal to worship models as witnesses. That was the key phrase in the text.
Exactly. When you step 100 million years back, you are stepping outside of any possible witness. You are effectively in a simulation based on math. The source argues that we should prioritize the human horizon, the observed, remembered, continuous reality over the deep time simulation.
It's a bold epistemological move. It privileges the subjective human experience over the objective mathematical projection. It's essentially saying, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, it didn't create time.
But is it subjective? Or is it the only thing we actually have? The human world, the one where we build bridges and write books, is definitely young. We know that. The debate is whether there's a ghost world of deep time underneath it.
I think ghost world is unfair. That ghost world contains the oil we burn and the tectonic plates that cause earthquakes. It has predictive power. If we ignore the deep time model, we lose the ability to find resources or understand natural disasters. We use those models because they work.
I don't think the source forbids geology. It forbids the narrative of deep time, the idea that we're insignificant specks in a billions of years old void. It recenters the universe around the human story. It suggests that the purpose of the physical world is to stage the human drama.
Which brings us back to the theology. This view aligns perfectly with the Genesis narrative. A recent creation, a catastrophic flood that reshaped the surface, which explains those young deltas, and a continuous memory via the genealogies linking us to the start.
It offers a synthesis. Instead of fighting science with faith, it redefines the terms. It says, the physical evidence of the deltas shows youth. The textual evidence of the genealogy shows continuity. The only thing contradicting this is a deep time model built on assumptions we simply cannot verify.
It solves the cognitive dissonance. I'll give you that. If you accept relational time, you don't have to apologize for the Bible not matching the geological timescale. You just say the geological timescale is a ruler measuring the wrong thing.
So where do you land? Do you see the value in dismantling the clock?
I see the utility of it for analyzing history and scripture. I think the concept of relational time is brilliant for understanding how ancient people saw themselves. They weren't counting seconds, they were counting connections. That is a genuine insight that historians should probably use more often.
But
But I cannot fully abandon the universal clock. I think the physical world has a reality independent of human witness. The tree falls in the forest even if no one hears it, and the uranium atom decays even if Adam isn't there to count it. I worry that if we retreat entirely into the human horizon, we solipsistically shrink the universe to fit our own heads. We make the universe small just so we can feel big.
a valid fear. But consider the alternative the source warns against, a world that is a graveyard of forgotten ages. If deep time is the ultimate truth, then 99.9% of time is silence. It is emptiness. It's millions of years of animals eating each other with no one to watch or remember. The human horizon proposes a world that is a lived place.
Recently formed, deeply remembered, and fully accounted for.
That's the promise. It suggests we aren't lost in the cosmos. We are in a room that was prepared for us recently. It changes the feeling of history from a cold void to a warm, crowded room.
It's certainly a more hospitable universe, and it forces us to be humble about what we know versus what we infer. I think that's the part I can get on board with, humility. We shouldn't confuse our models with the territory.
That's the key takeaway. Whether you buy the young Earth conclusion or not, the distinction between clock time and relational time changes how you read history. It reminds us that for most of human existence, time was a measure of relationship, not mechanics.
And perhaps we've lost something by handing our time over to the atom and the quartz crystal. We've gained precision, sure, but we've lost that sense of continuity. We know what time it is, but we don't really know who we are relative to our ancestors.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the sediment of the Mississippi to the speed of light, and back to the family trees of Genesis.
It's a dense topic, but for the listeners, I think the question to chew on is this. When you look back at history, are you looking at a timeline on a wall, or are you looking at a chain of hands holding on to one another?
That's the image to leave with. The world might be older than we can imagine, or it might be as young as the stories we tell, but the only time we can ever truly inhabit is the time we share.
Indeed. A fascinating reframing of the origins debate.
We hope this discussion has helped illuminate the strongest arguments from this perspective. It's not about declaring a winner, but about understanding the texture of the disagreement.
Thanks for listening to the debate. Keep questioning the ruler.
We'll see you next time.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. I am your host, and as always, I am joined by the person who reads the footnotes, so I don't have to, our resident expert. Hello.
Hi there. It is great to be back. And I have to say, I read a lot more than just the footnotes for this one. This was a big one.
You had to, because today we are tackling a monster. I mean, usually on this show, we look at things that are happening now.
Right. The immediate.
We talk about the latest tech breakthrough or a shift in the economy or maybe some new psychological study about why we doom scroll. We are usually very present tense.
We stick to what's in the headlines.
But today, we are doing the exact opposite. We're zooming out. And I don't mean zooming out to look at the last decade. I mean zooming out to look at, well, at everything. We were talking about time. Big T time.
The invisible framework, the thing we assume holds everything else together.
Exactly. And we're diving into a really, really provocative piece of writing. It's titled The Horizon of Human Memory. And I'll be honest with you, and with you, our listeners, when I first picked this up, I thought, okay, what is this? Is this a history lesson? Is it a geology paper? Is it some kind of, a theology tract?
And the answer is yes.
It is all of them. And that is what makes it kind of brain-melting, It takes these three disciplines, archaeology, geology, and biblical studies, which usually stay in their own separate corners.
They absolutely do. They barely speak the same language.
Right. They're on opposite sides of the university campus. And this source forces them to sit at the same table and talk to each other.
And historically speaking, they don't always get along.
No, they do not. That's putting it mildly. But this source argues that the reason they don't get along, the reason we have this massive ongoing conflict between science and scripture and history, is because of a mistake.
A single, really fundamental mistake.
And it's one that we all make, apparently, usually without even realizing it.
It's an assumption that's so deep we don't even see it as an assumption. We see it as, well, as reality.
So before we get into the mud, and we are literally going to get into mud later on, let's set the stage. The source opens with this challenge to the very concept of time. It identifies what it calls the core mistake. What is it? Because when I look at my watch, time seems pretty straightforward. It ticks. It talks. Seconds turn into minutes. What am I doing wrong?
Well, the mistake isn't in reading your watch. The mistake is assuming that the watch on your wrist represents a universal cosmic reality.
Okay.
We tend to think of time as the source calls it a universal external clock.
Let's unpack that. Universal external clock. What does that mean in practice?
Imagine there is a master stopwatch floating somewhere in the void of space, and this stopwatch started ticking at the Big Bang. And it's been ticking away at the exact same speed with the exact same rhythm for everyone, everywhere, for billions of years.
So whether humans are here to observe it or not, the clock is just ticking.
That's the assumption. We assume that time is a container. It's this rigid, absolute, unbending box that the universe sits inside of.
Like a movie reel, and we're just moving through the frames.
Perfect analogy. And so when we say 1 year, we assume that 1 year meant the exact same physical thing 10,000 years ago, or 10 million years ago, as it does today when we measure it with an atomic clock.
It feels intuitive, though.
Yeah.
But if I wait 5 minutes for a coffee and a guy in ancient Rome waited 5 minutes for, I don't know, a chariot, it's the same 5 minutes, isn't it?
Locally, in our lived experience, yes. But the source argues that when you stretch that assumption back into deep history, into the abyss of the past, as it calls it, it distorts everything. It argues this whole idea of clock time is actually a very modern invention.
So we built the machine,
Yeah.
and now we think the universe is a machine.
Precisely. You nailed it. We invented mechanical clocks to coordinate trains and factory shifts in the 19th century. We invented the Gregorian calendar to organize our taxes and religious holidays.
These are tools, human tools.
They're just tools. But we have confused the tool with reality itself. We started treating the calendar like it's a law of physics, and because of that, we miss what is actually right in front of our faces.
We do what? We try to jam everything into that framework.
We do. We try to force the messy, organic, relational reality of the world onto this rigid, linear grid. And when things don't fit on the grid,
We just ignore them.
we either ignore them or we invent these incredibly complex theories to explain them away, just to save the grid.
Okay, so the mission of this deep dive and of the source material is to stop doing that, to put the grid aside for a minute.
Yes, the mission is to strip away the inherited traditions. And the source is very careful here to call out everybody. It says we need to strip away theological traditions and scientific assumptions.
It's an equal opportunity offender then. I like that.
It is. It wants to get down to the bedrock. It's
Right.
asking, what happens if we stop assuming and start observing? The goal is to look at what can actually be observed, remembered, and known.
I love that distinction. Known versus assumed. We assume so much about the past, don't we?
We assume almost everything about the deep past. We don't know it. We infer it. We model it. We create stories about it. But we don't know it in the same way you and I know that we're sitting here right now having this conversation.
So the big aha moment the source is driving at isn't about selling us a new dogma.
No,
It's not saying, hey, believe this weird theory instead of that weird theory.
not at all. It's about reorientation. It's asking us to pivot our whole perspective. Instead of measuring the world by the mechanical clocks we invented a few hundred years ago,
Yeah.
the author suggests we should start measuring the world by memory, by human continuity.
A world measured by memory. That sounds very poetic. It sounds like something you'd read in a novel.
It does, but as we were about to see, the source takes this idea and applies it to very hard physical things.
Okay, so it's not just a philosophy.
It is surprisingly tangible. It's a way of looking at dirt.
Okay, let's do it. Let's start with the first big concept from the source, the human horizon.
The human horizon. This is where we start looking at what the text calls the human world.
And just to be clear, by human world, we aren't talking about biology, right? Not DNA or bones, necessarily.
Yeah, primarily no. We're talking about civilization. We're talking about the stuff of us.
The evidence that we got organized.
Exactly. Cities, paved roads, large-scale agriculture, writing systems. metallurgy, smelting ore,
Yeah.
complex trade networks that span continents, the things that leave a distinct layer in the earth that says, hey, organized people were here and they were doing business.
It's the difference between a temporary campsite that washes away in a week
Mm-hmm.
and a city like Rome or Babylon that leaves a footprint for thousands of years.
A footprint you can't miss. Now, if you look at that record, the archaeological record of human industry and civilization, the source makes a very specific observation.
And this isn't controversial, you're saying?
The observation itself isn't. No, it's pretty standard archaeology, even if the implications are fiercely debated.
Okay, so what is the observation?
The observation is that this human world, this world of cities and writing, it does not extend indefinitely backward.
It has a floor, a starting point.
It has a hard floor, and it's a surprisingly shallow floor. Everywhere you look on the planet, whether it's the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, the cities of the Indus Valley, the early dynasties in China, the temples in the Americas, continuity ends. It just stops.
And it ends within a narrow window,
Yeah.
not spread out over 1,000,000 years.
A very narrow window. We are talking thousands of years, not millions, not hundreds of thousands. You dig down and fairly quickly you hit the bottom of civilization. You hit sterile soil.
Okay, I have to play the skeptic here. I have to. Because we've all watched the documentaries on the Science Channel. We've seen the CGI cavemen hunting mammoths.
Of course.
The standard timeline says that anatomically modern humans, people who look just like us, with the same brain capacity, have been around for, what, 200,000 years? Maybe 300,000 years now?
That is the standard evolutionary narrative, yes. The idea of hunter-gatherers roaming the savannah, chipping flint for hundreds of millennia.
Right. So we have this vast, vast epoch of prehistory. Just endless empty time where apparently nothing much happened. No cities, no writing, no wheel. But this source seems to be directly challenging that picture.
It's not just challenging it. It's saying that picture is mostly an assumption based on very scattered data points, a jawbone here, a handful of stone tools there. Whereas the human horizon, the horizon of memory and civilization, is dense, continuous, and recent.
This is where it gets into the idea of hidden worlds, right?
Yes, and this is a really key point for understanding the argument. We, as a culture, we love the idea of hidden worlds.
Oh, absolutely. Atlantis.
Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu. The idea that maybe there was a global high-tech civilization 50,000 years ago that had flying machines and crystal power sources, and then it got wiped out by a comet or a solar flare or something.
The ancients. It's the plot of a dozen video games. It's the plot of so many movies. We want there to be a secret, forgotten history.
We do. It appeals to our sense of mystery and grandeur. But this source just throws a big bucket of cold water on that entire fantasy. It argues that the physical record simply doesn't support it at all.
Because if there were a global civilization 50,000 years ago, we'd find more than just a few flint chips.
We would find the trash, we'd find the industrial waste, we would find the foundations of their cities, their quarries, their mines, their radioactive isotopes from their power plants.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the footprint our civilization will leave. You won't be able to miss it.
Right.
The source argues that the human record is dense. Once it starts, it explodes. We go from pottery to better pottery to bronze to iron to writing to iPhones in a very short, continuous, and accelerating sprint.
It's a startup curve. It's not a flat line for 300,000 years and then a sudden, inexplicable vertical spike.
Exactly. The source is saying, just look at the evidence on the ground. The evidence shows a beginning. And that beginning isn't buried under miles of rock from millions of years ago. It's right there. In most places, you can dig down a few meters and you hit the bottom of it.
So the core argument so far is that the human world, the world of memory, the world we actually know and can trace, is young.
It is surprisingly recent, and that observation is the launch pad for everything else.
Now, this is where the source makes a really interesting pivot, because usually when people talk about a young world, they're coming from a theological perspective. They're quoting verses.
Right. It's often framed as a purely religious argument.
But this source pivots to geology.
It goes straight to the physical evidence.
It goes to the mud, specifically river deltas.
This was my favorite part of the reading, honestly, because it takes something so mundane, so boring mud piling up at the end of a river, and it turns it into a clock, a physical, geological clock.
Okay, so let's explain this mechanism. How on earth does a muddy river delta act like a clock?
Well, you have to think about what a delta is. The source calls it a cumulative system.
Cumulative, meaning it just adds up, it doesn't go backwards.
It only goes one way. A river, let's take the Mississippi or the Nile or the Tigris-Euphrates, any big river, it flows across the land. And as it flows, it acts like a giant conveyor belt.
Okay.
It picks up sediment, dirt, sand, silt, clay, everything.
That's erosion happening upstream. In the mountains, on the plains, gravity pulls that dirt downstream.
Right, so the river is like this muddy soup flowing towards the sea. And when that moving water hits the still water of the ocean or a large lake, the current slows down dramatically.
Loses its energy.
It loses the energy to carry all that heavy dirt. So the dirt drops out of suspension, it settles on the bottom.
It creates a pile.
It creates a pile, a huge one. And over time, year after year, flood after flood, that pile grows, it builds up until it breaks the surface of the water. Then it starts extending outwards, creating new land where there was once ocean. That new land is the delta.
So it's like a receipt printer that never turns off.
Yeah.
The river is constantly printing a record of its own activity in the form of new land.
That is a fantastic analogy. The delta is the paper trail of the river's history. And here's the crucial thing. We can measure how fast that printer is printing.
Ow.
We can measure the sediment load in rivers today. We can look at historical maps and see how fast the land has been extending over the last few centuries. We have a pretty good idea of the rate of accumulation.
What happens when you do that?
And if you take those known rates and you run the math backward, the receipt isn't that long.
This is the kicker, isn't it?
This is the geological bombshell. The source points out that major deltas across the globe, the biggest, most important river systems on Earth, all correspond to the same general time frame.
What time frame is that?
The same time frame as human settlement and the rise of agriculture.
Wait. They started building at the same time we started building our first cities?
Roughly, yes. Even in mainstream geology, it's generally accepted that the formation of the current delta systems we see today is a recent phenomenon happening in the last several thousand years, mostly in what they call the Holocene epoch.
Okay, so hold on. If the Earth's surface were millions of years old in the way we usually picture it, meaning these rivers have been flowing in roughly the same channels, eroding the same continents for eons, where is all the mud?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If the Mississippi River had been flowing like this for, say, 1,000,000 years, the Gulf of Mexico should be filled in by now. Or the delta should at least extend halfway to Cuba.
But it doesn't.
It doesn't, not even close. The deltas are shallow, geologically speaking. They're active. They are dynamic. The source argues they are not endlessly layered monuments to millions of quiet, uniform years. They are young, energetic features on the landscape.
So the implication is that the very surface of the human world, the ground we build our cities on, the fertile farmland we depend on, hasn't been sitting there unchanged for eternity.
No, it has been forming and stabilizing within the same window that human memory occupies.
It's like we showed up to the party just as the house was being finished.
Or we showed up on the construction site just as the concrete was drying. And that's what the source calls the convergence of evidence.
The convergence.
You have archaeology saying civilization started a few thousand years ago. You have human memory myths, genealogies, oral traditions from all over the world saying, we remember the beginning and it wasn't that long ago.
And then you have the physical geography.
And you have physical geography, things like these river deltas saying, yeah, the land itself stabilized and took its present form right around that same time. All the lines of evidence point to the same boundary line in the recent past.
It does. Now, the source makes a very important distinction here about what it means by young.
Yes, this is crucial to avoid misunderstanding. We need to be really clear about definitions. When the source says the world is young, it doesn't mean young in a naive, childish, or unsophisticated way.
It's not a pejorative term.
Not at all. It means young, as in measurable, coherent, and continuous. It means the story is tight. It's not full of these huge gaping holes where we have to just guess what happened for 100,000 years at a time. The record is dense and complete.
And what I find fascinating is the author's insistence that this conclusion is totally independent of our calendars.
Yes, this isn't about trying to prove that the year is 2026 or 5786 or any other number from a religious calendar.
The mud doesn't care.
The mud does not care about Pope Gregory's calendar reforms. The mud doesn't care about the Julian calendar. The sediment doesn't care about BC or AD. This is a physical observation of the world humans actually inhabit. It's about relative sequence and scale.
So we have established this physical horizon. The world, as we experience it, is a recent place. The stage is fresh. Now, the source pivots, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
And maybe a little controversial for some of our listeners.
This is where we go from geology to text, from mud to meaning.
The source takes this physical framework, this idea of a young, measurable, coherent world, and applies it to how we read ancient texts, specifically Scripture.
Right. And this is where that universal clock error really comes back to cause massive problems.
The source talks about the distortion of modernity. The basic idea is that we are reading the Bible wrong because we are reading it like 21st century spreadsheet-loving Westerners.
We are forcing the text. That's the phrase it uses. We have this terrible habit of treating ancient authors as if they were modern bureaucrats or scientists with atomic clocks.
Right.
We assume that when they wrote down a number or duration of time, they meant exactly what we mean when we look at a digital stopwatch.
We assume they were secretly recording Gregorian years, thousands of years before the Gregorian calendar was even invented.
Exactly. We treat the text like it's a sterile scientific document, and the expert in the source notes that this is a huge anachronism. It's an imposition on the text. It's not respect for it.
So the argument is you aren't taking the Bible literally, you're taking it modernly. And that's a different thing.
That is a very, very distinct difference. And to explain this, the source introduces this idea of the ontology of time in Scripture.
Ontology. That's a $10 word. Let's say the listeners a trip to Google.
It just means the nature of being, or in this case, what is time to these authors? How did they experience reality? What was its fundamental nature for them?
And the answer is not ticks on a watch.
No, not even close. The text measures time through generations, through overlap, through lineage and succession. It is profoundly relational.
So it's not asking the question, what year was it on the universal calendar?
No, that question would have been meaningless to them. It's asking who came before whom and who knew whom, whose life overlapped with whose.
It's like, okay, think about a family reunion. You don't usually talk about your great Aunt Sally in terms of specific dates, like born 1928, died 2012.
Right, that's what an obituary says.
That's the obituary. But in the family story, you say, she was grandma's older sister, she was there when the old house burned down, and she held me when I was a baby. You place her in the web of relationships.
That is a perfect example. That is lived time. It anchors the person in the living memory of the family. The source argues this is a completely different ontology of time, and it's one that aligns much closer to actual lived human experience than our abstract dating systems.
We experience life in moments and relationships, not in raw abstract numbers.
Precisely. And the calendar is just a tool we invented to manage that experience on a large scale. It's like a ruler.
I love this ruler analogy. Go on.
Okay, so if you have a table and you measure it with a ruler that uses inches, you get one number. If you switch to a ruler that uses centimeters, you get a different number.
But the table didn't change size.
The table is still the same table. The table is history. The ruler is the calendar. The source argues that biblical chronology never depended on our modern uniform sequential rulers. It depended on the table itself, the continuity of generations, the overlaps, the lived memory.
Which leads us directly to the big one, the huge stumbling block, the thing that makes modern readers just roll their eyes and close the book. Longevity. We have to talk about Adar and Methuselah.
The 930 years.
And the 969 years.
Yeah. Genesis says Adam lived 930 years. And usually you get two camps responding to this. Camp 1 says, that's biologically impossible, it's a fairy tale, the book is nonsense, throw it out.
Right, the scientific dismissal.
And the other camp, the defenders, they say, no, wait, maybe the atmosphere was different. Maybe there was a vapor canopy protecting them from radiation. Maybe human DNA was purer and hadn't degraded.
They try to find a physical, biological mechanism to explain the number. They try to make modern science fit the math of the text.
Exactly. But this source takes a totally different route. It says both camps are making the same fundamental mistake.
They're both assuming the number 930 is a measurement from a modern stopwatch.
So what is it then?
The source interprets this relationally. It says the text is not making a claim about superhuman biology. It's not saying 930 Gregorian solar cycles. It is making a claim about continuity. It is claiming that Adam's life spanned an extraordinarily large portion of early human continuity.
It calls him an anchor of memory. An anchor of memory. Think about the compressed human world we talked about, that shallow, recent horizon. If the entire human story is short and dense, then a long life serves a critical, practical function. It ensures that the first generation is still around to talk to the third, fourth, maybe even the fifth generation directly.
So Adam isn't just some guy who lived a really long time. He is a living library. He's the bridge that connects the beginning of the story to people generations down the line.
Yes. His life serves as an anchor in a sea of time. If Adam is still alive when, say, Lamech is born, which the genealogy suggests is possible, then the memory of the beginning doesn't degrade. You don't have the game of telephone problem where the story changes a little bit every time it's told.
Because you can just go ask the source, hey, great-great-great-grandpa, tell us about the garden again.
Tell us about the beginning. Exactly. The source argues that once we view these ages as relational longevity, as a measure of the span of influence and memory rather than just ticking seconds, the supposed conflict with modern science it begins to dissolve.
Because the text isn't making a claim about biology. It's not saying humans used to be superheroes.
It's not asking for some arbitrary magical math. It is describing a world where early generations overlapped so deeply that memory was preserved without fragmentation. You didn't need writing systems at first because the original witness was still sitting at the campfire with you.
Wow. That blows my mind a little bit. It completely reframes the question. It shifts the focus from how is that physically possible to what does that mean for the integrity of the story?
It means the story is trustworthy because the chain of custody is so short and so robust.
And that fits perfectly naturally within the young human horizon we talked about earlier.
It does. If the world is millions of years old, human memory is useless. It breaks. You can't remember back 100,000 years. But if the world is recent and lives overlapped, relational memory is incredibly powerful.
This brings us to the lists of names, the genealogies. I'll be honest, when I read the Bible, I usually skim these parts. So-and-so begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so. It feels like reading a phone book.
You are not alone in that. I think that's the common experience. Most people see them as boring filler, or maybe as symbolic poetry, not as real history. But the source argues they are absolutely crucial. They are boundary markers.
Boundary markers, meaning what exactly? Like a fence?
Exactly like a fence. They define the edges of the map of history. The source says they aren't meant to be elastic bands. You can't just stretch them out to fit whatever timeline modern science currently likes.
So you can't just say, oh, between this guy and his son, there are actually 10,000 years of missing unnamed people.
Right. You can't just insert huge gaps wherever you need them to make the timeline work. The source argues the very structure of the genealogies is there to assert that no abyss exists.
That is a strong phrase. No abyss exists.
It's a very strong claim. They are saying there is no gaping black hole in history where we forgot who we were. They are saying there are no missing civilizations, no lost epochs of prehistory. This is the whole story from start to finish.
It's a bold claim. It's basically saying we have the receipts.
We have the chain of custody.
And again, this circles right back to the archaeology we started with. The archaeology says we don't see any evidence of global civilization before this point. And the genealogy says we don't remember anyone before this point. They agree.
They shake hands across the disciplines. And sitting right in the middle of this compressed timeline, the thing that splits the old world from the new world is the flood.
Oh boy, the flood. Talk about a topic that gets people heated. How does this source handle it? Is it arguing for a literal global flood with a wooden boat?
It actually sidesteps that specific debate by focusing on the flood's role in the narrative, not just the physical mechanics. It positions the flood by its function, not just by a specific date.
What is its function?
Within this young world framework, the flood is a rupture within human continuity.
A rupture, like a break in the bone or a tear in the fabric.
Or a hard reboot of a computer system. It sits after that early anchored lineage we just talked about, the Adam phase, but before the rise of widespread post-rupture civilization.
And crucially, it sits before the deltas.
Right. It's positioned in the narrative right before the river systems of the world stabilized and began building the massive deltas we see today.
So the narrative of the flood actually explains the transition we see in the geological record.
It explains why the post-flood world looks the way it does. It answers a lot of questions. Why does everything seem so sudden and recent? Why do we see rapid resettlement of the globe? Why do distinct cultures seem to pop up almost out of nowhere with full language and technology in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, all around the same time?
Because it wasn't a slow, gradual crawl up from the slime. It was a recovery. It was a restart.
A rapid recolonization of a fresh, empty landscape. The source argues that whether you view the flood as a global event or a massive regional one, its placement in the timeline is coherent. It explains the landscape. It explains the recent sediment layers. It fits perfectly into a human history that is less than 10,000 years old.
So it's not some myth from deep time. It's being presented as a piece of remembered history that explains the physical world we are literally walking on.
That's the strength of this synthesis. It insists on coherence. It wants the story, the geology, and the memory to all tell the same tale, to fit together without contradiction.
But, and there's always a but, we have to talk about the elephant in the room.
Physics.
Physics.
Yeah.
Big science. The stuff we all learn in school that says the universe is 13.8 billion years old and the Earth is 4.5 billion years old based on things like radiometric dating. How does this source reconcile that? Is it just saying all of that science is wrong?
No, and this is where the source pulls a bit of a judo move, which I found really clever. It presents what it calls a critical inversion of logic.
I love a good logical version. Walk us through it.
Usually the narrative is that the scientific view, deep time, billions of years, is the one based on hard observation, and the young view is based on blind faith in an old book.
Right. That's the standard narrative. Science looks at the rocks. Faith looks at the book. One is objective, the other is subjective.
But the source argues that deep time actually requires more faith in the sense of unprovable assumptions, not fewer.
That seems completely counterintuitive. How does it make that case?
Okay, to get a clock that can tick reliably for billions of years, like radiometric dating, you have to assume a lot of things are constant. You have to assume uniform gravity throughout all of cosmic history. You have to assume constant decay rates for radioactive elements.
Which we can't prove. We've only been measuring them for 100 years or so.
Exactly. You have to assume stable space-time. You have to assume that the clock has never been touched, shaken, moved, or altered. You have to assume the rules of the game have never ever changed since the opening whistle.
We call that the principle of uniformity, right?
Precisely. The present is the key to the past. But here's the problem. Modern physics, specifically Einstein and general relativity, tells us that time is not absolute. It's not a constant.
Right. This is the plot of the movie Interstellar. If you go near a black hole, near a massive gravitational field, time slows down.
Exactly. We know from experiment that gravity affects clocks. We know that high velocity affects time. We know space-time isn't a static grid. It bends and warps and stretches. So the source argues that deep time survives not because we observe it directly. No one has watched a rock for 1 billion years to see if the clock is steady. But because it is protected by layers of assumption. We assume uniformity to make the math work and get the big numbers.
So the inversion is the young worldview is actually more empirical because it sticks closer to what we can actually see and verify.
It claims to be the framework requiring the fewest assumptions. It relies on direct observation. We see the deltas are young. We have the written memory in the text. We have the archaeological record. It doesn't require us to extrapolate a ruler back into an invisible deep past where we can't possibly verify the conditions.
So it's not anti-science. That's a really important point.
No, and the source is very, very clear on that. It refuses to frame this as Bible versus science. It frames it as observation versus inference.
That is a key distinction. Inference is filling in the blanks based on your model. Observation is just reading what is on the page or what's in the ground.
The source says it is a refusal to worship models as witnesses.
Ooh, that is a great line. Worship models as witnesses.
A scientific model is a wonderful tool. It's useful for making predictions. But it isn't a witness. It wasn't there. The source argues that science is strongest when it stays close to what is tested, observed, and remembered. And Scripture, when you strip away the bad theology and the modern calendar imposition, operates in that same empirical space.
It feels like the source is trying to broker a peace treaty between these warring factions, but on very specific terms.
It is a synthesis, a robust synthesis, as the text calls it. It says, look, the human world is young and coherent. Geography supports that. Human memory confirms that. Scripture preserves that. The conflict only exists because we are asking the wrong questions and imposing our modern assumptions on everything.
We are asking the text to be a physics textbook. We're asking the rocks to be a history book, and neither of them was written to do that job.
You've got it. When we abandon that false precision, that neurotic need to have a specific Gregorian date for everything, the conflict just dissolves. It was an artificial conflict all along.
So let's zoom out. We have to wrap this up. What does this all mean for the listener? We've talked about mud. We've talked about Adam's lifespan. We've talked about Einstein's theory of relativity. How do we pull this all together?
I think the core message is about the nature of reality itself. It's a fundamental worldview shift. The source suggests that time is not something floating behind reality, like a ghost or an empty container.
It's not the background music of the universe.
No, time is, and I'm quoting here, what reality leaves behind.
Time is what reality leaves behind. I love that line. Unpack it for me.
It is the residue. It's the effect of action. It is change recorded in matter, like sediment in a delta. It is memory recorded in people. It is continuity recorded in a story, like a genealogy. Time isn't some abstract dimension we travel through. It's the pile of stuff we have built. It's the trail we've left.
And when you view time that way, the world changes. It no longer looks like this terrifyingly vast, ancient graveyard of forgotten ages where humans are just a meaningless blip.
It becomes a lived place,
Yeah.
intimate.
Yes, a lived place. I like that.
Recently formed,
Yeah.
deeply remembered, fully accounted for. It makes human history feel important, connected.
It removes the alienation, doesn't it? That modern sense that we are lost in a dark, empty, ancient universe. Instead, it's like we are in a room that was built for us recently, and we know everyone who has ever lived in it.
And that is the reorientation the source wants us to have. From that position, Scripture doesn't need to be defended against science with convoluted theories. It simply stands where reality stands on what can be known and remembered, not on what must be assumed about a past no one can see.
It really is a profound shift in worldview. It's asking us to trust our memory and our eyes more than our theoretical models.
Which is a bold ask in the 21st century. We love our models, we trust our algorithms.
We do. But maybe it's time to love the evidence a little more.
I think so.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground today. I mean, we've gone from the sediment of the Mississippi Delta to the Garden of Eden and all the way to the fabric of space-time.
Just a typical Tuesday at the office.
Exactly. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought to Taiwan. We've spent this hour tearing down the idea of the universal clock. We've suggested that maybe, just maybe, history is shorter, denser, and more coherent than we think.
And that our connection to the very beginning of the story is more direct than we realize.
Exactly. So here is the question I want you to carry with you this week. If we stop trying to defend our favorite theories, and instead just start by looking at where reality actually stands on what can be known versus what must be assumed, how much of our understanding of history is based on the clock we invented rather than the world we actually live in?
That is the question. Are we measuring the territory, or are we just obsessing over our map?
Something to think about next time you check your watch. Thanks for diving deep with us.
See you next time.
Keep looking at the horizon.